Everybody, today I'm Andrew Nelson. I'm the chair of the Department of Anthropology here at the University of Western Ontario, and we're here to welcome Adia Benton today for a much anticipated talk. I'm going to start off with a little introduction to Regna Darnell, who has sponsored this distinguished lecture, and then we will have a land acknowledgement. Greg Beckett will introduce the speaker, and then we will actually get to the speaker. Regna Darnell came to the Department of Anthropology at Western in 1990, coming to us from the University of Alberta. And in her time here, she's served as department chair. She was the founding director of the First Nations Studies program, which is now morphed into the Indigenous Studies program. And over the years, she studied linguistic and cultural anthropology in the prairies here in southwestern Ontario, but she's also been interested in things like cultural theory, history of anthropology, First Nations ecosystems health, the nomadic legacies of First Nation individuals, and finally she returned to the subject of her doctoral dissertation, Franz Boas, as the father of anthropology in North America. The Franz Boas paper project was funded in 2013 by Shirk Partnership Grant. Her research has garnered international recognition, including a number of impressive awards, including a fellowship in the Royal Society of Canada, Western's Helmuth and Distinguished University Professors Prizes, a Killam Research Fellowship, a Premier's Distinction Award in the Social Sciences and Humanities. Her interdisciplinary and collaborative approach to academia can be seen in her affiliations that include the Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies, Center for Theory and Criticism, Center for Ecosystem Health, and the Masters of Public Health program. She also has an impressive record of service to the university and to academia, including her term as department chair, 2 terms as faculty association president, and president of the Canadian Anthropology Society, and a number of other similar organizations. Her dedication to teaching is well known. She supervised more than 13 doctoral students and 3 MA theses over the last decade alone. In addition, she's established Regna Darnell Graduate Award for fieldwork in sociocultural anthropology, and this provides critical support for student retention and recruitment. So we're here today for the Regna Darnell Distinguished Lecture in Theory, Ethnography, and Activism in Anthropology, which Regna established in 2017. The objective of this lecture series is to bring internationally recognized anthropologists into the department. I'll let her lay out the key objectives of the lecture series in a moment, but briefly, it reflects Regna's belief that anthropologists should be activists, with collaborative anthropology holding the key to giving voice to people we work with and work towards decolonization. The Department of Anthropology is grateful for Regna's contributions to scholarship, teaching, and service, and for establishing this excellent lecture series that brings Dr. Benton to us today. So, Nicole, can you give us the land acknowledgement, please?
Absolutely, Professor Nelson. So, we are gathered virtually on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples, connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. For those of you beyond Western University's lands, I highly encourage you to situate yourself using the native land link that I will post in the chat afterwards. We respect the long-standing traditions and relationships that the Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge the historic and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada, such as, though certainly not limited to, the water insecurities that have presently been experienced by Chippewa, the Thames First Nations, who remain under a boil water advisory, and things such as the continuous violence against Indigenous women and girls. As anthropologists, we recognize the contributions that our field has made to the formation and perpetuation of these injustices. And as workers within a public institution, we accept responsibility to positively contribute towards reconciliation by correcting misinformation, both within and beyond the bounds of academia, as well as cultivating respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. We will strive to improve understandings across cultures and are dedicated towards working to create equitable relationships with the nations that host us on your land. I ask that you take a moment to reflect on your positionality and actions towards reconciliation, and I highly encourage you to share these contributions and ideas in our collaborative space after the lecture. And I'll pass it on to you, Professor Beckett.
She will go to Regna next to introduce the lecture series.
Thank you, Andrew. The Franz Boas Distinguished Lecture Series is an outreach and dissemination initiative of a generous $2.5 million partnership from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The Franz Boas Papers Documentary Edition has funded a broad array of projects. Anthropology urgently needs a more flexible new paradigm that crosses and integrates intersecting diversities. I situate the history of anthropology at the intersection of theory, ethnography, and activism, and call for a fluidly evolving revisionist model that is open-ended, processual, and reflects the uncertainties of contemporary times. Transportable knowledge is about plasticity and complex causality in the absence of known outcomes or guaranteed successes. It crosses interdisciplinary, international, interpersonal, and institutional dimensions of variability. It speaks to the public good. Only grassroots political pressure keeps politicians focused on sustained attention to problems of climate change, social diversity, and other ills of contemporary society. Archival research engages community-based collaboration and feedback at all stages of a given project in response to community needs. Partners include the Musqueam Tribal Council, the American Philosophical Society, whose archives are the contemporary stewards of the Boas Papers, the University of Nebraska Press, who publish and market completed volumes, and 3 Canadian universities in 4 provinces. The governing body, an Indigenous Advisory Council, is supported by an international editorial board. The priorities are: 1, advise on community control, access, and dissemination of intellectual property. 2, digital knowledge sharing to return materials to their originating communities. 3, capacity building among community-based cultural experts in communities and in the academy, often the same people. Let me turn to Franz Boas and why we should still care who he was and what he said. Anthropology provided the methodological lens to frame his arguments and application to any subject or crisis. A new way of looking at social ills of his day that persist into our own tumultuous times. Boas is remembered primarily as a scholar of Indigenous North Americans, but he also engaged the critique of race as anti-Semitism intensified in Nazi Germany, an activist alliance with the Afro-American pedagogy of empowerment and self-realization of W.E.B. Du Bois, the cultural maelstrom of the Harlem Renaissance through Zora Neale Hurston, the rich Caribbean and African traditions devalued by the American mainstream, Melville Herskovits, and an activist agenda in Mexico, Manuel Galmiel. To give one illustration, I parallel his long-term support of community-based linguist Elakari Deloria, Standing Rock Sioux, and Zora Neale Hurston, remembered today more as literary scholar than anthropologist, as parallel poles integrating Boas's experience of racial diversity in the interwar years. Thank you.
Thank you, Regna. And Greg, if you'd like to introduce our speaker.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Benton is Associate Professor of Anthropology and African Studies at Northwestern University. She's a cultural anthropologist and a medical anthropologist who specializes in global health and, among many other things, on how care is provided in humanitarian emergencies and in development projects. Her research is focused on patterns of inequality in the distribution of and the politics of care, and on the political, economic, and historical factors shaping how care is provided in complex humanitarian emergencies and longer-term development projects like those around health, for example. Her first book, HIV Exceptionalism, Development Through Disease in Sierra Leone, which explored the framing of AIDS as a, quote, exceptional disease and how that framing takes away from other diseases and public health challenges in poor countries, won the Rachel Carson Prize from the Society of Social Studies of Science in 2017. She's currently working on The Fever Archive, a book that will explore the 2014 to 2016 West African Ebola epidemic, focusing on the militarization of public health response, US biosecurity, and the global war on terror, and what she calls the racial immunologics of triage and the politics of care. Dr. Benton has published extensively in a wide variety of venues on topics including the visual analyses of humanitarian images, race and humanitarian professionals, security and military paradigms during epidemics, and the temporality in an era of antiretroviral therapies for HIV/AIDS. Dr. Benton is also a leading public intellectual and expert. She regularly speaks to journalists and podcasters on issues of global health, political economy, race, and gender, and is a leading figure in developing novel modes of public engagement through her widely cited and followed blog, ethnography911.org, and her Twitter account at ethnography911. The title of her talk today is Inoculating History, Salvaging What Is Held, Race, Epidemiology, and Immunity from Freetown to Atlanta. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Benton.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Greg, and thank you, Regna, for your wonderful project and endowment, Andrew for the invitation, and Laura for coordinating all of this. It's like, you know, herding cats, I know. So today I am going to, I guess I'll just start because I you know, things happen. We're trying to see how long it can be. Please bear with me with some, I think I might have a few technically weird things because I will be sharing sound at some point. And actually, I wonder if you can tell me if this is going to work, because I'm now thinking that it might not with my sound.
We see your desktop now.
Which is weird because you technically should be seeing. I'm not sure why this is suddenly, that's why. Okay, and so you're hearing my sound?
We can see the PowerPoint.
And you can hear me talking.
Can hear you talking, no
That's
additional sound.
That's perfect. So I just wanted to make sure, because with headphones, it usually changes all kinds of things. So as mentioned, the title of this is Inoculating History and Salvaging What Is Held. And it's a kind of work in progress from the book that I've been trying to finish for a couple of years. So we'll begin in 2017. So in August 2017, I joined a special curator tour of the Ebola People, Public Health, and Political Will exhibit at the David J. Sensor Museum, which is located at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. The museum's website and the driving directions attached to the email confirming my tour reservation suggested arriving early so that I could go through security. There were 2 security checkpoints, one near the entrance of the campus and another one located at the museum's entrance, which is pictured here. It was the second time I'd been to the exhibit in as many days, but on this visit I arrived by foot, which seemed to cause a bit of confusion for the 3 security guards that were posted, who were likely unaccustomed to tourists who are also pedestrians. Atlanta and its unwalkability, particularly in this side of town, though it has gotten better in the past 20 years, surprisingly, it weighed on my encounter with the guards. "Whoa, ma'am, whoa," a guard shouted in my direction. I hesitated, confused. I'd been walking along the edge of the road leading toward the museum when the sidewalk abruptly ended. "You have to cross, here." The guard signaled toward the areas marked with yellow paint, and then you can walk on the sidewalk again. "Where are you trying to go?" And I say, "To the museum." And they point me in the direction. So the museum's entrance was another few 100 feet from the guard's kiosk. But as I'd been warned in the email, and as I knew from my visit the day before, I would also have to pass through this second layer of security at the museum's entrance. So I made friendly small talk with the 2 uniformed guards, who were middle-aged Black men who could easily have been my brother or my cousins or my neighbors as I signed in. I offered my passport as identification because I was heading to Sierra Leone that same day. And I signed the visitor's log, waited for the guard seated at reception to give me my badge. Two of them traded banter as I waited. Do you always give each other such a hard time? The guard seated next to the x-ray machine and metal detector chuckled, placed my items on the conveyor belt and made me walk through the detector. He said, you're good to go and enjoy the tour. So the other side of the checkpoint, which is here, and I think on the poster that circulated, I didn't put the picture in this PowerPoint, shows that there's the sun-flooded atrium seating area where the handful of museum visitors wait for the tour to start. Overhead, there's a massive widescreen monitors that play day-to-day work of public health. In one segment, Black women socialize in beauty salons. They educate each other about physical fitness and weight loss. In another, members of the CDC's Special Pathogens Branch share the excitement they experience when investigating an outbreak. So as we neared the scheduled starting time, a small crowd of around 30 people began to gather near the first panel of the exhibit. We visitors were distinguished from employees by the generic pink and salmon pre-printed visitor badges clipped to our shirts. Employees chatted with each other, their photo ID badges printed on sturdier plastic material hanging around their necks. At 12:30 sharp, Louise, the museum coordinator, corralled us to the start of the exhibit and made introductions to the docent for the curator tour. It takes a village to make an exhibit, she told us, as she introduced Pierre Rollin, who is the French physician and epidemiologist and veteran Ebola responder standing there in the white shirt and jeans. Guided by Louise and Pierre, we were pulled into and channeled through the organizing logics of US public health and its culture. And I'm reminded of Boaz's discussion of the role of the museum and the organization of culture areas. And I'm kind of playing with that idea. The people to which the exhibit title referred, in people, public health, and political will, was a gloss for population, which serves as the object of public health intervention. The elementary structures of outbreak investigations, person, place, and time, were also part of that organizing logic. A zoomed out view of the political economy of the region, a view that was described by a TripAdvisor reviewer of the museum as too leftist, but was in reality just liberal. And then a constrained account of US politics and individualized political agency, encapsulated by the milquetoast phrase, political will. So in the first few panels of the exhibit, which are pictured here, we learn about a timeline for the West African outbreak, where it fit into the grand scheme of Ebola outbreaks since its discovery in 1976, and the social, ecological, economic, political factors shaping the historical levels of transmission in this region called the Mano River region, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, which had previously not seen an extensive outbreak of the disease. So when I first started to conceptualize this version of the book project, I was spurred by connections between dual crises spanning the Atlantic in late 2014. That the first was the movement for Black lives in the United States and the response to Ebola in West Africa. And I'd started to think about the pandemic response in relation to racial capitalism and related concepts of capture, enclosure, care, and containment, which formed threads through the chapters. I should also point out that to some extent, this formulation is kind of rooted in a way in some of this Herskovitzian notion of the sort of traces of the Black Atlantic kind of moving through the space. So when I was asked to comment on Vin Kim Nguyen's recent writing and thinking on the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo, he introduced a not yet fully theorized idea of humanitarian capture, which I interpreted to mean that the humanitarian industry and humanitarian ideologies, the ethics of emergency, exert political influence to take control of the decision-making apparatus of the state. So instead of, say, corporate capture, we're talking humanitarian capture. And specifically, I found that the modifier humanitarian was useful for thinking about how humanitarian practices are sutured to market mechanisms of extraction, exploitation, dispossession, and displacement. So what specifically about humanitarianism lends itself to these practices, to have its activities organized via these logics? I argue here that a lot of it is rooted in a sentiment, in demonstrating concern. So for me and the purposes of this lecture, the museum is a key site for examining this form of capture for the CDC, a key actor in the outbreak response. And I should probably preface this by saying that the CDC does not see itself as a humanitarian organization by any stretch of the imagination, though it may express or at least try to think with or espouse certain kinds of humanitarian ideals. But they're a key actor in the outbreak response within the US and internationally. The CDC's participation in the official response marks the agency's largest deployment of staff ever to an outbreak, with 1,500 deployments to Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. 80,000 person days of effort. This is how you know it's a government agency, right? And a level 1 emergency operations activation, which is essentially the 24/7 situation room thing that you imagine. It's like a room surrounded by screens with clocks for every time zone and conference room tables. And at some point, it was said to have processed something like 80% of the samples that were sent in for diagnosis. And we're talking 30,000 cases over a year and some change, or over about a year. So we're talking about a lot of samples being processed through the CDC. So these capture logics and practices are mirrored in the museum on multiple levels. One level concerns the context in which the diagrams that I will examine are made. And what collecting and gathering practices make it possible for certain objects to appear centrally in the exhibit, to stand in for, say, the representational practices of outbreak investigation and management. And I'll show this with a whiteboard, but also this stunning array of forms, maps, and graphs that fill up the museum's walls. So this is sort of, these are actually items and items in the exhibit. A second thinks with Atlanta as a key node in the US imperial network, where the history of malaria, slavery, racial segregation, and late native dispossession sits in uneasy tension with Black prosperity, residential segregation, and inequality. The way that Toni Cade Bambara mentions it, or describes it in her book, Those Bones Are Not My Child, she describes Atlanta as Gone with the Wind Atlanta, New International City Atlanta, Atlanta, Black Mecca of the South, second Reconstruction city, home of a bulk of Fortune 500 companies, and so on and so forth, which becomes important in the second part of this lecture. The third level focuses on how CDC chooses to represent all of these facts and their interventions into them to the public as a method of inoculating itself from its own pathological and pathogenic histories. So how and why do all of these objects make their way into the collections of the CDC Museum? How and why do some objects fit into the story CDC wants to tell about itself? Again, I want to draw attention to the relations among these objects and how they relate more broadly to a version of global health that is very much US-centric, operates through US racial, bureaucratic, administrative frames, and which circulate widely in the developing world. So what might the gathering and collecting practices in one context have to tell us about those same and similar practices in the other? So I'm trying to look at the double lives of these objects in the field and the museum, again, interestingly spurred by reading of Boas's theory of a museum in the American Natural History Museum, which I have visited for they had an Ebola exhibit sort of tacked on to like a giddy worm exhibit, another project that I'm working on. And so it's helping me to think through the logics, logistics, and practices of humanitarian capture, which in the case of the US public health, bifurcates, institutes, reproduces labor and spatiotemporal hierarchies, the moral and racial coding associated with them. This is a lot of blah, blah, blah. But basically what I'm trying to show, here are the bifurcations that I'm particularly interested in, because these are the ones that came up as I talked to people who were part of this massive response, both in the CDC and outside of it. And so what was interesting is those were the distinctions between the field and the office, or the field and the hotel. And the reason I bring this up here is because one of the things that sort of came up as I talked to people from various parts of the response is they complained that the CDC officials were sitting in the hotel room or in the hotel situation room in the basement, just waiting for data to come to them, right? So they were never, and they only cared about the data, and they weren't really invested in providing technical assistance in other ways, which is fascinating because in the museum, there are these pictures of people like walking in the grass, wearing, their big backpacks, and sleeping under bed nets and doing those things that people associate with field work. The other tension that is there is between clinical medicine and public health. So caring for patients versus providing technical assistance, which is, and so slaking epidemiological models' thirst for data, putting together all of these sort of data sets to be able to make sense of the situation on the ground. And this duality's inscription into the CDC's identity from the 1970s forward, under the administration of the global health superstar Bill Foege, who I will briefly talk about later. And then there's this patrol work versus detective, it should say detective work and not police work. So who is intellectually equipped to perform the labor of active surveillance versus the labor of passive surveillance and investigation? And this is a racialized distinction, as are all of the others. They are and again, just to kind of get back to that, when I talk about the labor and the spatiotemporal hierarchies and the moral and racial coding associated with them, this is where I see these bifurcations manifest and playing out. So the circulations across these boundaries are focused on bringing the action back home and projecting a certain vision of the agency's value to the US national health and well-being, and the place of Black life, of Blackness in this vision, in the calculations of value. So this tour was scheduled to last for 2 hours, but we had spent like half of the time lingering in those first third of the exhibit's 21 sections with Louise, who had offered a general overview of the exhibit, and Pierre, who chimed in with Ebola-specific expertise and local color from his years responding to Ebola outbreaks in Central and East Africa. So Louise was really conscious of our limited time together, and glancing at her watch, she told us that we would skip ahead to 2 yet to be disclosed highlights of the exhibit, one that she selected and another selected by Pierre. I'm only going to focus on the Louise favorite, because I thought it was the most interesting and visually compelling. She brought us to this, which is the whiteboard, which is on the left of the screen. And it's basically you can see it. Some people have probably seen this before, or some of you maybe even went to the exhibit. But this is the whiteboard that she selected and helped, I guess, to pick for the exhibit with the US Public Health Service Captain John Redd. And this was mounted in a custom-built black walled enshrined in plexiglass. It had been used in the Western Area District Ebola Response Center, or the Command Center, which had been located at the British Council in Freetown. A colleague of theirs had packed and delivered the item to Atlanta. "Isn't it the most spectacular piece?" she said. A few members of the tour group moved closer to the whiteboard to inspect it more carefully. So did I. And I looked around and scanned everyone's faces. I couldn't tell if they agreed with Louise's assessment because everyone was sort of trying to kind of take in. Let me see if I have another. Yeah, this one's better. And so, I'll just sort of briefly explain what this is, because I think it's actually important to think about what's actually going on here. So basically it's this whiteboard. It's divided into 6 sections, and each sort of section is a generation of infection, and these all cover roughly June to July of 2015, and each generation contains a red, black, or green squares, and each of the squares is containing a little bit of information about each person represented by the square. So the index case, the leftmost square reads MK M35 O0606R16/06S. What does that mean? So the color of the square, along with the text written inside of it, encodes the circumstances of MK's Ebola infection in Freetown, Sierra Leone. And this is actually in this neighborhood called Magazine Wharf, which I used to pass through, but never spent a lot of time in, even though it was fairly close to one of my former field sites. So MK is a 35-year-old man who experienced symptoms of the disease on June 16th, 2015. He reported his infection to health authorities on June 16th and eventually survived. So in epidemiological parlance, he's the sole member of Generation Zero. He is the index case for the group of infections. So put another way, in this cluster of Ebola infections, MK is thought to be the primary case from whom others in his neighborhood contracted Ebola. Each of the arrows leading from MK signals a contagious relation. That is, a relationship of disease causation, of closeness and contact, of infection. Each of the subsequent infections from these contagious relations occurred between relatives, co-workers, neighbors, coexisting and caring for one another. Was this a spectacular piece? Many of us were struggling to make sense of what we were seeing, the spectacle at the center of our question. After all, the whiteboard diagram had not been drawn for us, the museum visitors, but for and by the epidemiologists and other field workers investigating the Magazine Wharf cluster. It was never meant to be preserved as contents fixed in time and space for as long as the whiteboard is stored in the CDC warehouse. It was meant to be written on, erased, the process of tracking cases begun anew. If the whiteboard, as Mettleman suggests, represents an unlimited recording capacity with the loss of any permanent trace, then it had likely held information organized about earlier clusters. What is underneath? The Magazine Wharf cluster whiteboard as a cultural object encourages reflection on its embedded politics and epistemologies, to quote Shannon Mattern. Its metadata would be the data source, why it was compiled and by whom, which logics were used to process raw data that make up the chart. What we didn't immediately see in the drawing were the multiple actors, the dozens or so teams that visited Magazine Wharf daily. There could be 80 to 90 people kind of descending on this neighborhood once infections had picked up. And they collected the information, each little bit of information organized here. What labor does such collection entail? The small bits of clinical biography it condensed into facts of contagions, of relationality via kin and care networks, via virality itself. So once the whiteboard had left its anchor in Freetown, it was no longer a tool of unlimited recording capacity and ephemeral exhibition, but a museum object. And even if its contents at first seemed cryptic to us, many of us were familiar with the role that the whiteboard plays in professional fields as a way to depict and visualize description and explanation with the aim of either maintaining or reforming them. So the interesting thing, so there's a point at which I have found in this digital archive of the museum an interview between the curator and this public health service person, John Redd, who was offering his own interpretation of this whiteboard. And he said, it reflects people. Each of these boxes is a human being. And what always strikes me both at the time and now as I look back, because now this is, of course, this is from the summer of 2015. So it's 2 years ago for him. All of these people, these are all people, and you can see how they're related. It brings the tragedy of Ebola into focus, because even though there were thousands of cases, there were almost 4,000 deaths in Sierra Leone, for example. But each of those was an individual person. And that's what I really think when I see something like this in such detail, because ultimately controlling Ebola was about trying to save people. So where Red is reminded of the humanity of his interlocutors via their depiction as contagious subjects, I'm reminded of the humanitarianism, adherence to industry norms of expressing common humanity as a hallmark of concern and compassion of Red and his co-workers, expressed through the collection of objects from the field. The whiteboard is a standard in epidemic thrillers and police procedural dramas. In epidemic films like Contagion and Outbreak, for example, epidemiologists use the whiteboard to describe and explain patterns of disease transmission and to showcase their expertise for the viewer. I'm sure if you've seen that movie, you remember this. This is when everyone learns about R0. You probably never thought you need to know that information, right? But here we are. So, and then the police procedural, in the police procedural, it's a mnemonic device that allows detectives and other crime analysts to keep track of relationships among suspects, victims, and accomplices, bodies of evidence linking them to a crime. This comes up again. So here, the whiteboard diagram functions as a technology that both enables intervention and relationships, disease causation, of closeness, of contact, of infection. Each of the subsequent infections from these contagious relations occurred between relatives, coworkers, neighbors, coexisting and caring for each other. Though they refigure the boundaries between the representations of scientific facts that facilitate interventions and cultural artifacts that exhibit the intervention. As synecdoche of the operations center, it helps to orient the strategy for mobilizing boots on the ground or the shoe leather detectives such that they can reach every point of contact among kin, neighbors, and colleagues. It also represents such strategic mobilizations by helping epidemiologists to visualize contagion or patterns of relation mediated by the virus. So I went through this small collection of documents I pulled together about Magazine Wharf, because again, it was a place that I often passed through to the east end of Freetown, but I never really paid a lot of attention to it, even though it was often in the news for a bunch of reasons. And some of the earliest scholarly writing in Magazine Wharf was in the form of tropical medicine research, focused primarily on the extent of mosquito breeding and the variety of anopheles in the area. Assessing children's malarial infections via spleen measurements. If I were much more attuned to my PowerPoint presentation, I would show you the pictures of the measurement, the lady doctors measuring children in the 1920s and 30s. But the contemporary writing about the place is largely centered on the public health and development projects implemented through community-based organizations like this picture here. This is actually a military personnel who started an NGO for children affected by Ebola. And it's also talked about as being the place with a horrible water and sanitation situation. You hear it especially from, say, the local news. And so among the oral history interviews in the CDC digital archives, several people offered some insights. And I'm going to try this and see if it works. I found these to be potentially useful for thinking about how this was actually playing out amongst the workers, the CDC workers at least.
This is Sam Robson. Today's date is...
And so I ended up getting into the case. Yeah.
Sorry.
The thing that was difficult in the outbreak was that, I mean, it shut down the local healthcare system, but it also shut down health resources for our team.
Right.
And one of the really big challenges was that febrile gastroenteritis was so common on our team. I had 2 or 3 people a day calling me with fevers and diarrhea and vomiting.
Sarah's
and
prior expertise in
foodborne
diarrhea haunted her.
Yeah.
I want to pause here to note that these are, because I did not introduce them, these are two of the senior officials who were working. Well, these are two senior officials. I did mention that they were John Redd and Sarah Bennett. And there is an oral history project carried out by the CDC where they talked to, I think it was maybe up to 100 or so different people. And so these people are the ones who are actually responsible for coordinating different teams in space. So there's a lot to say about all of this, but I'll do, actually, there was it's a longer story, but I will play this segment.
So as I said, these teams were, and there were probably 8 of them, 8 teams, each of which probably had 10 to 15 people. It would vary a little bit. So there were really a lot of people down on Magazine Wharf who were clearly there looking for Ebola. So it was easy to tell who was an expat and who wasn't, and not just not just because of skin color, but
yeah, because there's a lot of responders that were not,
right. But people, there were loads of locals, but they would always have T-shirts or something identifying them. So this woman had been down on Magazine, and it was very, very hot, and then you tromp up and down the stairs, and it was really pretty brutal sometimes. And she got up to buy but bear in mind that they're down there asking, does anyone have diarrhea? Anyone vomiting? And she got back up and was walking by the fish market and was just sort of overcome by the smell and vomited. And that word went around the wharf pretty quickly that she'd been sick. It was incredibly quickly. I mean, they're so, it's a talking culture, and the people are so densely packed, and boy, stuff would.
It kind of makes you wonder, actually, the cases that we think we missed in the wharves that kept that transmission sort of percolating along in the wharves. Everybody must have known that those cases existed.
Right.
I mean, it's so you can't hide anything in the wharves.
Because we were sure that
you can hide them from us, but you can't hide it from the people of the wharf.
That would have been happening.
So I want to kind of backtrack a little bit. I didn't want to bore you by playing like 3 minutes of audio, especially without captions or subtitles. But in the previous segment of this interview, which lasts for about 2 hours, in the previous segment of this interview, they kind of outline what it was like around the time that they were they were working in. And so they all stayed at this place called the Radisson Blu Mami Yoko Hotel. And at some point, because everyone knew that the wharves nearby were percolating infection, they'd quarantined all of those spaces around the hotel. So the people in the hotel could still move in and out very freely, but these, slum dwellers and their quarantine were actually, they were like butted up against the Mami Yoko Hotel, but there's free movement in and out of the hotel because of these folks. But they were also, so they were doing their visits from their hotel. And the idea was that there was like this sort of what I would call or think about as this quarantine that basically mirrored these kind of colonial town formations in terms of the segregation related to disease transmission, and also the free movement of certain people versus others. So the wall, as one of my good legal anthropologist friends who studies extradition treaties he says, walls are not just barriers; they're also channels. They're ways of tracking movement. And so I didn't play that segment, but it was the thing that kind of moved me before. One of the other things that they do in that segment, and the reason that the fish market and the smell is important, is in their descriptions of Magazine Wharf. You saw those pictures. They focused on how it smelled, how treacherous it felt because of the heat. And there's a way that they sort of talk about this and the other hotels, like what it was like to be sick and have to be forced to stay in these hotels that were actually quite horrible. And also how they felt like they should be inoculated by their non-Sierra Leoneanness, right? So that their movements actually shouldn't be. And so they were often trying to protect, like, so they were really concerned about vomiting and whatever in public because they didn't want people to think that they were sick. And the assumption was that they in fact were not sick with Ebola. So that's something to, that's sort of a part of this sort of broader racial immunologic that I've been trying to talk about. So now that we're kind of out of magazine wharf, or I hope we're out of magazine wharf, I kind of want to go back to August 5th, 2014 in Atlanta, because that's when the story of the exhibit actually began. So on the day that this missionary volunteer aide, Nancy Wrightwell, became the second American evacuated to Atlanta from Liberia to be treated for Ebola, she was accompanied by police and FBI escorts from Dobbins Air Reserve Base, and Wrightwell was met by several attendants at the Emory University Hospital on Clifton Road. The ride to the hospital, while described by authorities as uneventful, was a media spectacle that drew unwanted negative attention to the CDC, which is located on the same road, mere blocks away, for people who are not familiar with Atlanta's sprawling geography. And so this CDC, so on this street, there's a sea of media, according to Louise, with reporters and camera people roving between the CDC and the hospital. And so she decided at that moment to draft a formal request to the CDC employees who'd been deployed to the Ebola affected region to return with objects from their field work. And when I was having this, I was interviewing her on the phone at this point, and she says to me, after lowering her voice, I wasn't going to let that happen again. And I remember writing, what is that? You know, but I wanted to keep her talking, so I didn't stop her to say, what was that? Because she eventually told me what that was. And that referred to her failure to recognize the significance of the 1979 to 1981 Atlanta child murders and disappearances when they were happening. The story was this. Louise arrived in Atlanta in the late 1970s, and had worked for the city's historical society. It was like her first job, you know. And she was collecting and cataloging materials of historical significance at the same time that 24 Black children from Southwest Atlanta, mostly boys, 9 to 14, but also there were a couple of girls, and they were turning up missing, or they turned up dead. So Black families everywhere were on high alert. In my hometown, Columbia, South Carolina, which is about a 3.5, with my dad driving, it was 3.5 hour drive from Atlanta. And we speculated about the possible killers, and we feared for our lives. And as I was rewriting this part of the book, I texted my brother, Joey, who was about the same age as many of the missing and murdered children. And I asked him if he remembered anything about the murders. And he said, I want to say that we went to Atlanta during that time for the Black Social Workers Convention. I was scared to death. And so I said to him, did I go too? And he said, yeah, you were there. Because, you know, who would leave a 3 or 4-year-old at home, right? So indeed, the annual meeting for the National Association of Black Social Workers was in Atlanta in 1981. I called my father to see what he remembered, given the annual meeting also typically included service work in Black communities where the event was held. He remembered few details, but he was able to recall 2 things: a fundraiser for the Mothers Group that had launched its own investigation of their children's disappearances and deaths, and how frightened my brother had been. So these children's deaths and disappearances had clearly left its mark on communities well outside Atlanta's borders, but the terror and despair left in their wake were mostly deeply felt by Atlanta's Black poor and working class neighborhoods, all of which were at the time in the opposite pole of the city from CDC's main campus. So why had that, her failure to document the murders of Black children, been Louise's point of reference that day for her work documenting the Ebola crisis that was unfolding in West Africa? Where was I when I was not collecting those materials, she asked. And so I did wonder, and I asked myself, I didn't ask her, even though I eventually talked to her multiple times after, like, why is she why is she concerned about this? I think at the time I was afraid to stop her and ask her explicitly. But also because I think I worried that it would be illiberal for her to have to acknowledge that she's talking about the sort of racial, gendered, class underpinnings of her failure to conceive of these crimes as historically significant at the time. So if we start from those kind of feelings about the silences in the archive about Black suffering in Atlanta, it is possible to discern how US racial politics, along with global racial hierarchies, suffuse CDC institutional memory and memorial practices. In this case, it served as a motivation to begin rapid response collection of materials from West Africa, a kind of salvaging response, I think. So put bluntly, the same racialized gender and class inequalities that made it a story of historical insignificance have also supported this archival humanitarian impulse to demonstrate concern through collecting objects that testify to and signify victims and heroes' struggles, tragedies, and triumphs. But of course, this was only part of the story, right? You know, it was never just about like her own feelings of shame and guilt. I realized at some point that I had not actually been down to the permanent exhibit in like 20 years. So I went in 2018 and I took a self-guided tour after meeting with Louise. And that's when I realized that she wasn't just like riffing, right? It was more than her reflection on what Trio called about the first moment of historical production, the silence inherent in the creation of sources. So somewhere in the middle of this permanent exhibit downstairs is a section called A Public Health Approach to Violence. So this is what the bottom looks like. And this panel chronicles the role of the CDC in establishing violence as a public health problem, with explicit reference to a period that a handful of CDC epidemiologists assisted the Atlanta Police Department with their murder investigation. So let's take a step back for a second. The CDC, I said I would mention Bill Foege, and this is when I'm going to do it. He was the CDC director at the time, much heralded physician epidemiologist. He was a smallpox eradication campaign veteran. They call them the Order of the Bifurcated Needle, I kid you not. He was a global health champion, and he was quite keen to build up a public health involvement in violence and injury. And this is documented in the CDC archives. In part, this was rooted in his sense that the field of public health paid insufficient attention to the social causes of death, debility, and illness, but also in his duty as a director to carve out CDC's niche in a crowded health field within the US government. So there's also the National Institutes of Health, and they were kind of jockeying for a position. So he and his colleagues wanted CDC's niche to be prevention. But Congress kept rejecting the agency's proposal to include violence and injury prevention in its mandate, despite the fact that the agency's epidemiologists had been at the forefront of gathering and analyzing fairly comprehensive data about the character of violence or intimate violence. And so that's actually what's in the sort of timeline that you see there, 1973 being the moment at which they started doing this data collection work. I happened to interview some of the epidemic intelligence officers who worked on this case, which was kind of cool, but also interesting, right? One of them actually works with biological anthropologists on gut biomes. Who knew? So the first was Marty Blazer, who recalled that he had recently returned from investigating an outbreak of GI illness out west, gastrointestinal illness out west, and was hosting I think he was actually having a bris at his house. And he read in the newspaper that the Atlanta Police Department had enlisted the assistance of clairvoyants and psychics to find leads. And he said, and I thought to myself, I'm sure an epidemiologist could do at least as well as a psychic. And I thought we should do an epidemiological examination of what's going on here. And that night, actually, I had difficulty falling asleep, he said, which was unusual for me because I was thinking about it. It was really a kind of shift in direction for me. But the next day I went to my boss, who had already done some work on gun violence, and he thought this was a good idea. He took it up the ranks to the CDC hierarchy to find out, could we do this investigation? Would it be permissible? And could we work with the Atlanta Police Department? And eventually it went up to Bill Foege. As is common for all outbreak investigations, CDC needed to be invited by its local counterpart to become involved. They enlisted the support of the Fulton County Health Department and received their invitation. National news provided substantial coverage of the controversial decision to bring the CDC scientists into the investigation team. In one interview, Public Safety Commissioner Lee Brown expressed his ambivalence towards CDC's involvement because he did not see how methods of epidemiologists would differ from his own methods. He says, I suspect they are not much different than the techniques we use. They too gathered detailed information about victims and sought patterns that could explain their fate. Recollections about the nature of the relationship between the police and the CDC were in conflict. While Marty told me that he remembered a fairly cordial working relation, Janine Jason, a pediatric HIV epidemiologist, had a different perspective. The police, she said, were not pleased with our involvement. They wouldn't give us the access we needed. They suspected the parents in a few of the cases, but wouldn't tell them which ones, which meant that their data set was not clean. Comparing police and detective work, she told me, no one really goes out for an investigation without a shot at getting an answer. You design studies to not miss the thing you hope is the answer. Police are the same, but less organized. And anyone who tells you they're entering the field objectively, they're lying. I took this as like a hint and a warning, also for anthropological field research. And I asked each of the EIS officers about their use of the case control study. And I'm doing this because I want to if you can see on the sort of bottom left-hand side, there's actually a photocopy of this article that they wrote in JAMA, in the Journal of the American Medical Association. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I found it fascinating in a bunch of different ways. And I'm trying to see if I can find it. This is what it is. So you can actually see this a little bit more clearly. This is a case control study. I'm not sure if they actually show that in the, but I asked them about this because I don't know if I should ask. Everyone knows what a case control study is. You basically set up a study where you find people who have the disease and then people who don't, and you match them according to different characteristics to see if there's some difference, right? So if you're trying to, that's why it's important to know that some of these people were used to investigating foodborne outbreaks, which makes a lot of sense when you're at the church picnic, right? If everybody gets sick from the potato salad, it's really easy to make a list and talk to everybody and go, oh, did you have diarrhea? Oh, did you eat the potato salad? And then we can figure out that that's what it was, right? I think it's different for crime, and I think it's different for murder, but we're going to talk about that. So I asked the EIS officers about their use of the case control study. Mind you, this is 40 years later, but a lot of them had kept their papers. And so some of them were actually really surprised about the study, if that makes sense. Like, why did I ask these stupid questions? Is actually something that one of them said. But they said, our goal was to try to understand, or Marty said, our goal was to try to understand, to begin to analyze the cases, to look for common factors. That was the first part of the investigation, to see if you know what and he says, you know what epidemiologists do, they investigate person, place, and time. And you know, what's the time course? What's the epidemic curve? What are the localities? What are the personal characteristics that distinguish one person from the person who's afflicted with the disease? In this case, being murdered versus somebody who was not afflicted with the disease. Joe McCormick, who investigated the Lassa fever outbreaks in Sierra Leone in 1976 and the first outbreak of Ebola in Sudan and Zaire ever, was more explicit in his recent memoir. He says, an outbreak investigation is very much like the investigation of a crime. It consists of detective work, following hunches, and carefully collecting evidence. In epidemiology, however, the criminal is the bug. find the bug, and then find out how it got to its human hosts. The bug's motive? Making a lot more bugs, I guess. But it's not just the bugs you're dealing with. You have to deal with people, especially the victims. It requires some effort to explain to them what you're doing and then convince them to cooperate. He describes his primary tool, the case control study. It's a scientific method that we use to discover the most important differences between the people who did become sick and those who did not. If you can determine those differences, particularly when it comes to foodborne outbreaks, you are usually close to pinpointing the case or the root of infection. So it cannot be overstated that public health was not well understood, nor were CDC's motivations above reproach at this point in time, particularly where Black communities were concerned. The comedian and political activist Dick Gregory, like many Black activists, publicly questioned the decision to enlist the CDC's help, given their limited expertise in forensics or pathology. There were also rumors that the CDC themselves had kidnapped and killed the boys for experiments. Some might recall that the US Public Health Service, of which CDC is a part, had at that time been publicly criticized for its role in the Tuskegee syphilis study, but it is unlikely that Tuskegee, in the way that it is deployed today, needed to be invoked. There were other medical and scientific encounters that made Black people very wary of the CDC and its motivations. So I just wanted to go back actually to this text that's right here, because I think I'd like to reflect upon it with you if possible. But there's a point, it actually says here, from 1979 to 81, Atlanta was gripped by a series of unsolved murders and a number of missing children cases known locally and nationally as the missing and murdered children. This is actually when Louise realized that she didn't have any information. She went to the Historical Society and said, oh my goodness, why didn't I collect this? This should be in the archives. I should just be able to go there and pull information. And so it says most of the victims were boys between the ages of 7 and 14. All were African-American. And I always keep pushing up against or butting up against as concerned as other Atlantans. Which I think was actually one of the problems that sort of started all of this. One of the reasons it became national news is because the mothers had actually organized quite compellingly and very well to get more eyes on this. That was actually, it's the result of organizing that made this something that people actually wanted to take on. So as concerned as other Atlantans, CDC scientists offered to investigate these incidences of violence by using classic techniques of epidemiological detective work, not an attempt to identify the killer or killers. The study set out to determine common risk factors among the victims. The goals were to predict which of Atlanta's other children might be likely targets and to recommend preventive measures in high-risk communities. As you can imagine, this is a very, it's something to read. It's something to read this, 40 years later and to think with, as I think they just reopened the case a couple of years ago. So they had actually convicted a guy of committing 2 of the adult murders that were seen as part of this cluster. But as you can imagine, the methods used to talk about this, the methods used to investigate this by public health, I think has baked into it these really bizarre ideas about what can be known. And I also think it shaped the fact that it shaped the possibility of their participation, if that makes sense. So as it says here, it says this work was one of the catalysts that led to the establishment of CDC's violence epidemiology branch in 1983. Along with other violence studies, it demonstrated that the tools of public health can be applied to violence and its prevention. In 1992, the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control was formed with the mission to prevent injuries and violence and reduce their consequences. In other words, the deaths and disappearances of Black children, and by extension, the vilification of Black parents, which is actually, I didn't talk about in this, I'm not sure why I didn't. If Black parents form the institutional basis for agencies' extension into fields of violence and injury, and these issues into key public health problems. One of the things I didn't point out is, after reading this paper multiple times and talking about it with the epidemiologists, one of the things that happens is you see all of those names at the top of the paper. Those are people in the police department, the EIS officers. Acknowledged are all of the people who did the data collection. So who do you think interviewed children's parents in 1981? Black nurses who worked for the public health department. Why did they do it? Because, well, I think a lot of people wanted to help, but they did it because there was a real sense that if these white epidemiologists who are sitting here in the picture showed up at people's houses, there would be a problem. And even in the stories that Marty told me, he insisted that they did a drive-through in a white van of this neighborhood. And that they got out and everyone stopped and looked at them. And I'm not sure if he's remembering that correctly, but it actually is a trope in all of the documentaries and films that I actually watched about the case. So it made me wonder if they did that at all. Others did not remember doing a drive-through, but again, it was 40 years ago. And they were asking these parents, one of the things that I usually show is there's a chart that actually shows things like which elements which things that these epidemiologists put into the survey. And almost all of them were about things like whether the child is out of the house at a certain hour, whether there are men involved living in the house who are unmarried, so they didn't ask the questions about the appearance or the smell or whatever about the house, but they actually did take note. And that's written up in the methodology, which is that the nurses were supposed to make an assessment about socioeconomic class by looking at the condition of the children's clothes, the way it smelled and looked in the house and things like that, which interestingly is a lot like social work. You know, I talked to my father about that before he passed. And so there's like the way that sort of gets, all of the sort of weird racial politics of Atlanta kind of get played into this into this logic. So I've been trying to kind of pull it all together, where I've been thinking about the martial politics and epidemiological reason in kind of built into, or the martial politics built into epidemiologic reason. So whereas martial politics point specifically to racialization as a function of liberal notions of war, peace, and social order, epidemiological reason both acknowledges race as an independent variable describing a person or a population, as it often overlooks or evades institutional and structural dimensions of race and racism. In other words, it becomes the means by which the search for a single killer or organized group of killers might miss the point that the bug in this case might be the disposability of Black youth, the willingness of managerial elites to sacrifice these youth at the altar of global capital. And I think kind of global knowledge production, because every single one of these investigations doesn't really necessarily produce publications. I'll just put it that way, but it's certainly a part of this, the transaction of becoming an EIS officer. So in this lecture, I've been trying to think with these two objects in the CDC museum, or maybe it's more than two objects, and with Louise's provocation, which linked a failure to collect and secure the stories of Atlanta's murdered children, with archival and curatorial impulse to capture and enclose humanitarian objects related to CDC's involvement in the West African Ebola outbreak. An institutional narrative about the role of the agency in outbreak response is built upon the symbolic density of each of these objects as tools of connection, evidence, control, surveillance, marketing, and care. The substance of the institutional narrative rests in the bowels of this peripheral semi-public space on the campus's headquarters, relating a broader story about the agency's brand, its primary exports of epidemic intelligence, field epidemiology, and expanding notions of what constitutes a public health hazard. And for a brief period, another narrative straddled the museum's two levels, which is that Black people on both sides of the Atlantic were subjected to mechanisms of policing propped up as a form of pastoral care. And so I'll end there, and hopefully we'll have some kind of discussion about this. Thank you so much for listening.
That was great. Thank you very much for that. So Andrew, you want to take over on the Q&A?
Have I turned it on? Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Adia. That was amazing. That was really, really great. So we've got let me open the chat here, and you can put up your hands if you like, or post questions in the chat, and I can read them out. I'll just jump in and give everyone some time to think. This was so interesting, and something you mentioned early on and came back to a little later is I wrote it down here somewhere. The importance of demonstrating concern. That is at the heart of it seems so much of what the CDC does, and it's a question I had, I guess, about maybe the two cases. This, there's this impetus for demonstrating concern, this desire to demonstrate concern, and then there's the capacity to actually do it. And I'm wondering if you have any sense, even over the time period between the two cases you're looking at, whether the what enables that action to take place had changed. Are there things about the CDC itself that have changed, that have made it more possible for its representatives to act in ways that demonstrate concern? I don't know if that even makes sense.
I mean, yeah, it makes sense, I guess. I mean, so it's about, well, no, because it's about mobile. What can you mobilize? Like, what does concern mobilize, right? Like, what kinds of resources can concern mobilize? And I think what's interesting about it is concern is actually never, it's never valued, or maybe I should say it's actually undervalued and underestimated in terms of making those kinds of decisions. Yeah. So. And I'll use as an example, Obama's speeches about this in, say, August. I went back and listened to all the speeches because I was sort of obsessed with Donald Trump's daily press conferences. And I was like, is this normal? And so I went back to the Obama ones that I hadn't listened to. And one of the things he always emphasized, his messaging was, it's a good thing to do this anti-Ebola work. It is humanitarian, it is humane, but it is not just humane. We need to stop this thing at its source. If we don't get it controlled over there, it's going to be here. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's why the arrival of Nancy Wright Bull and before her Kent Brantley, these two American missionaries who were in Liberia, that's why people freaked out. They were like, why are you bringing them here? Treat them somewhere else. And that's also why they had the sort of theater of bringing the cops and the police and the military all like in a convoy with this person's ambulance or whatever. So concern is the thing that motivates a lot of actors, particularly in the public health space, but it's not sufficient to mobilize the resources to do so. And it often has to be accompanied by other kinds of benefits and often it is various forms of profit and various forms of sort of securitized protectionism. And those may or may not be the same thing. Like, I spent a lot of time looking at these like insurance agreements. So which contractors are actually used? It turns out that in the British case, the contractors for Ebola are the same contractors for, the war on terror. And my sense is that that's probably the same for the CDC, because how do you equip or how do you negotiate multiple airplanes that are equipped to handle level 4 viruses that will also be cleared to fly over certain kind of airspace? Like, I don't know if you know this, but apparently you cannot fly over EU airspace with a person with Ebola, like, unless you have some kind of special clearance. And it makes no sense. It's like, I was like, what? Like, how? Not that you have to fly over Europe to do this, but it's sort of like, there are all these random, or not random, very like rigid regulations about what can be done with a body that is infected with this thing. And a lot of it's about just keeping it where it belongs amongst Africans in equatorial Africa who and their like systems, which is another reason I wanted to play that longer clip of them talking about like, oh, what happens when we get sick? When we get sick, we just have, like we're like, we can't go to the embassy because the embassy doesn't want us. So a lot of us who are MDs just sort of took on that role of just sort of being like, you don't have Ebola, you just have like Campylobacter or whatever. Take some antibiotics and stay in your room until you're better. So I guess I think that, did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, and I mean, it makes me then think of the difference between those CDC folks, I guess, in 1981, who were as concerned as everyone else, and which is that's an amazing little clause to have at the beginning of that sentence. But clearly, they're not like other Atlantans. They're quite distinct, but also. The contrast between the case where they are at least communicating this idea that they are of this or somehow associated with this same place, where the people in Sierra Leone are clearly not. They're coming from afar. I find it all so interesting.
Yeah, well, they were told, and they were stumbling. I kind of I remember being like, ooh, like how do they? Well, and they're just giggling about their having to recognize that there's a distinction between the various people who are in this space. And one of the things I kind of wanted to get at, but I'm not sure I was explicit about, was in addition to CDC sort of being seen as these hotel data zombies, right? There's also this sense that they're the timeframes that they're allowed to be in on site are very much mandated by these government contracts as well, and liability and burnout and stuff like that. So when you hear them talking about their assignments, they're very clear about like, oh, I was there from May X to June, blah. And they kind of talk to each other in those like 2-week, these 2-week segments. I met a surgeon who actually had been an EIS officer during this outbreak, and he was in Liberia. And we were at dinner together, and he goes, oh, I was there for so long, like really long time. And I was like, why is he doing this? Is it because I'm an anthropologist? He's like, I was there for a really, really long time. Like I was in that really bad place that you talk about, like for a long time. And so I didn't say anything. He goes, I was there for 4 weeks. And I went, just sort of went, like, if I stayed anywhere for 4 weeks and said it was a long time, anybody, like I would just be laughed off my whatever. But that's a Malinowskian approach, but it was definitely anyway, that's what I was also talking about with these sort of spatiotemporal kind of hierarchies in terms of who gets to be where and for how long and under what circumstances, which absolutely shapes exposure, knowledge, like how knowledge moves. So.
Thanks. Any questions, hands? Something will come up, I'm sure.
I was just going to comment on your description of the woman walking past the fish market and dying. I've been past a lot of fish markets like that.
They smell bad, right?
Oh, yeah.
But it's a fishing town. Like this is one of Freetown's, I think, one of the deepest. It's a port. It's a big port too. It's one of the big deep water ports in the world. Like I think something like one of the top deep water something. There's like a whole thing about it. I actually my spouse's grandfather, I spent time with him. He used to actually run a pineapple grove in Cameroon in the 30s. And he said, oh, I've been to Freetown. And I was like, okay, I mean, he's since passed away, but you can imagine if he was doing this in the 30s. He's like, I was in Freetown. And I said, really? He said, yeah, like we would go and pick up pineapples and bananas on our way to Europe. And I don't know, it's sort of, I remember asking like, so what was it like? He said, well, there were a lot of like Lebanese traders and it was like this and it was like that. And I was like, huh, it's interesting what hasn't changed actually, in terms of the global circulations of like things through these West African ports. But
so we have in the comments, I can read it so that everyone can hear it, from Ryan Veith. So I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Just a comment, but I'm really thinking about the slippage between detective work and police work alongside the logistics of humanitarian capture and the whiteboard. A lot to think about.
Yes. I'm wondering, was it my, oh no, it wasn't my slippage, because I did have one of those things where the slide was wrong. But yeah, so one of the things I've been playing with a lot is, and again, this is probably an artifact of my like binge watching police procedurals and British ones in particular over, like the past 3 years. I've been like, what's next? When can I watch? Like, when is Vera coming back or whatever?
BritBox.
Shetland. So I'm always like super excited about Queens of Mystery. But I'd been sort of intrigued by the notion of the field as sort of the ground upon which all of this is happening, but also what that means for the production of knowledge, what it means for kind of the social worlds that you carve the field out of. And so the disease detective, which is the colloquial way that the epidemic intelligence service officer, like what they call themselves as part of their PR, which I know it's like, what's worse, epidemic intelligence or disease detective is cute, right? And it's like, they put it in the museum. But I think one of the things that is obscured by simply referring to them as disease detectives, it sounds super fun, kind of cool, Sherlock Holmesy. But the gist I felt was actually they're not non-state actors or non-governmental actors. They're actually government agents or people who act with, I think, some power of the US state to push into communities and ask people questions about their like personal everyday existence. And I do this I talk a little bit more about this in the chapter, when there are moments where these EIS officers or some of the junior epidemiologists are grappling with the fact they're entering a place like Magazine Wharf and knocking on people's doors and being like, is so-and-so here? He's a contact of such and such. And they're like, oh, they're like, no, he's not here. Of course, the person's like hiding in the corner or pretending to not be that person. And there's a moment actually when in that recording where the woman, Sarah Bennett, is like, I started vomiting because I got whatever. And I jumped out of the car and vomited. And my driver was like, we gotta go. I will buy a plastic bag and you can vomit in that, because I don't want anybody to see you vomiting, because they're going to take you away and we won't see you again. I mean, I was like, first of all, no one's going to take the white woman away. Yeah. But it was certainly like he was sort of, there's at least during those months, those August, September, October 2014, folks were going to get treatment, not coming back. Sometimes people didn't know where they were going. If some people would lie and say, oh, that person had, I saw that person with a fever. And then they just, all kinds of things happened around these like visible signs of sickness. And the policing. I know plenty of people who were like, I was in the holding center. I was not sick with Ebola. I got sick with Ebola there. Or I escaped because I didn't know what they were going to do to me. And the police would bring them back and put them back in holding. So this was, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's not there's no real distinction sometimes between police work and disease detective work. And that's a problem.
Certainly not, I'm sure, from the perspective of the people who are just facing these people, asking them questions. Who knows who these people are?
I mean, yeah, they're like, oh, we'll never know, but the people in the wharves know. And I'm like, yeah, there's a reason for that. That's like, snitches get stitches.
So we have a question all the way from Oslo. Mingwan.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm sorry, I have to leave in 5 minutes. So basically right after this question, I'm really intrigued by the concept of humanitarian capture. And could you please explain a little bit more on that?
Right. So, it was Vin Kim who said it, and he was talking, and I was like, oh, that's so cool. Like, I was just sort of like, oh, that's so cool. And I was like, did you write about this? He goes, no, I just made this up for this talk. And I was just like, okay, cool, let's talk about that. But he was basing it on corporate capture, and not like, so some people will use humanitarian capture to talk about like what's going on in the Mediterranean, to be like, the European ships are catching people and bringing them into shore to make sure they're safe. Someone might have even called what happened during the transatlantic slave trade, when the British were capturing ships to enforce the abolition of slavery under British rule. They might have called that humanitarian capture, but in this case, I'm talking about, and I think Vin Kim was talking about, a version of corporate capture in which humanitarian industry sort of takes control of certain kinds of government, state decision-making stuff, so legal and regulatory regimes. I mean, one thing that I would say is like a lot, like I was talking about this EU space, airspace thing, like so many of these decisions about how do you evacuate people, whether you evacuate, like which nationalities you can evacuate, all that stuff is like, these are racial immunologics, but they're ones in which they're legal frameworks that are, and insurance frameworks that are established between humanitarian entities and the state. Often what happened, and I think in this case with Nancy Wright-Bowl, the US should have probably helped to pay for her to come back, but actually it was Samaritan's Purse that paid. The NGO, so the NGO take responsibility. There's also humanitarian goods, like basically how they circulate. They're regulated by or maybe I should say, some of the private contractor and corporate whatever that are part of humanitarian enterprise kind of get to help make decisions about the distribution and the logistics of humanitarian action. So all of this to say, different kinds of organizations were trying to make something out of this humanitarian crisis. That includes companies that had been holding on to patents on potential drugs for Ebola, holding on to I mean, this is really relevant for the Canadians because that's where ZMapp came from. Canadian public money held on to the drug and then sold it off to like Merck or whatever, and they were able to develop it further. Most of these drugs and these therapeutics and diagnostics were created in the 90s in the anti-bioterror boom, but because these were diseases affecting very poor people living in a very poor place, there was very little motivation to develop these drugs, or to come up with these rapid diagnostics, or to do or to be able to scale up mobile clinics or PPE or any of those things. They kind of get shunted away until they are potentially profitable. And so I guess that's probably a long-winded way of saying what humanitarian capture is about. Sort of the like, okay, we're now ready to do the work. Like, yay, emergency. the state's not able to do it. And that was particularly the case for Sierra Leone and Liberia, maybe a little less for Guinea, given that they had more doctors, nurses, and resources. Blame African socialism in the 80s, I guess. So
thank you very much.
So I think we've got time for, because we're meant to be done soon to let you go. But Bree, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi. So really quick, I'm just interested to know your point of view on how do you think anthropology could impact the field of public health in the future? Like, how do you think an anthropological viewpoint could really help and aid in the field of public health?
That's a really big question, because I think one of the issues, and I've written about this, is the assumption that anthropology isn't there, because it is. And in fact, in this case, anthropology was one of the first disciplinary silos that, one disciplinary sort of one kind of expertise that was consulted. And I would argue that it's because of the nature of the thing, right? Which is, it's in Africa. This disease is quintessentially African. All of these, there are all these reasons, and it made it very easy to kind of insert anthropologists and therefore anthropological expertise into the intervention. And in fact, when I first, I'd say maybe July, June of 2014, a friend of mine who'd worked for a bunch of NGOs sent me a PowerPoint presentation from MSF that they used to I guess, induct their new people. And there was a cultural anthropology, medical anthropology set of slides in there. I had to be like, whoa, actually, here's a problem. you don't, I mean, it was something about behavior and like cultural belief, the kind of stuff that I think was not appropriate for this kind of thing, which is to say that non-compliance was chalked up to cultural difference rather than, I guess, political and economic conditions shaping access to information and access to actual things that would help one protect themselves and others. Because I only base that upon the fact that I was living in a place where there are a lot of Liberian diasporans, and they were talking to their families every week and being like, well, I had to explain X, Y, and Z about transmission. And so now my people are asking for plastic suits, boots, and chlorine. Once they were able to get that, they were able to kind of make decisions about how to care for people at home. But that was not, and that was true in Freetown as well. So this is a roundabout way of my saying, I think it depends on the version of anthropology. So anthropology is actually very easily co-opted, and I think easily brought into the fold because of based upon the kind of crisis that we were experiencing and seeing. I think understanding that every public health response or every response to a public health emergency requires a multidisciplinary, multi-expertise sort of thing. And not just that, it can't just be focused on the communities as barriers to progress. It has to understand that the intervention itself is also implicated in whatever is going on. And that was actually my biggest complaint. Anthropologists were sitting at the table, but they were very much constrained to focusing on, as their object of intervention and analysis, the community and the culture versus, what does it mean to have a 6-week contract versus a 2-week one? Or what does it mean when you put everybody in the Radisson blue? And what does it look like when so-and-so enters the household like this? What would happen? And I think I actually said this in a meeting full of anthropologists where we were on the phone with people in West Africa, and they were like, well, don't you know this is an emergency? We can't look at ourselves. That's crazy. And I'm like, 40 years of saying that. Like, it's not like I'm not the first person to say that. Like, everybody who works in humanitarian stuff, development stuff, they're like, yeah, maybe we should look at ourselves. Like, I mean, people were complaining about their field work and the conditions under which they were having to labor, the contractual, the infrastructural, the legal, the clinical stuff actually needed to be fixed too, systematically. When we enter, we are not entering in a hermetically sealed whatever. We become a part of the community somehow. I don't know if I answered your question, but I kind of like, I hate to be the one being like, well, we know stuff and they don't know that we know stuff, but I think they do. It's just stuff that they want us to be able to do is really circumscribed by this idea that we're somehow cultural key masters. And cultural gatekeep, somebody who can unlock every cultural gate and offer an explanation for why things just aren't working the way everybody wants them to or plan to.
Yeah, thank you. You did answer my question. The only reason I ask is that I'm actually like just about to graduate from my undergrad in anthropology and I'm going into my master's in public health.
Yes.
So just thought it would be a good question to ask.
Good luck with that. That is a really hard
you.
transition, by the way.
Yeah, I've gotten that.
I did that. Yeah, I mean, actually what I would say is take really good notes about the knowledge practices that they're trying to discipline you with. You will write a fabulous book if you if you just pay attention. You're like, this is how that I always say that there's a chapter in Byron Goode's Medicine, Rationality, and Experience about how medicine sees its objects that actually I think public health could use a similar treatment, because it's actually quite different, but it's also formulaic in the same way, because most of public health curricula were, I guess, created and sort of spurred on by medical doctors who were kind of put in the position of having to manage public health departments and outbreak investigations.
All right. Well, being mindful of the time.
Okay, so yes, so thank you so much, Dr. Benton. Am I closing this out, or are you, Andrew?
I think I'm supposed to, but
okay, I will leave it to you then. Thank you from me personally. Thank you so much. That was really great.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Benton. I think clapping from everybody, thunderous applause through the ether, and interesting questions. Very, very, very thoughtful. Sort of, the world needs more anthropology. So thank you.